Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and I finally have a Hermes machine in my collection. So if you follow any of the typewriter collecting groups or know of any other collectors, one of the most highly collectible typewriters out there is the Hermes 3000. It seems like everybody has to have one in their collection. And for a long time, I avoided even looking at posts of Hermes machines because I just always knew they were going to be too expensive. When I saw this Hermes Ambassador listed on Facebook Marketplace, I was a little bit in shock. Obviously, it looks a little rough, but I couldn't believe that it was listed for only $20 and was within half an hour of where I was staying at the time. So I got in the car and immediately went to go pick this up. Now there are a few condition issues with this Hermes Ambassador, as to be expected with something that only cost me $20. So when I picked it up, I did notice quite a few things that could use some work, including some paint damage, which we'll get into a little bit later. There was some surface rust as well. Now surface rust can be really damaging to a typewriter, keeping it from operating correctly. It can eat away at your springs, it can cause your type slugs to get caught in the type basket. So I knew I needed to remove a lot of that if I was going to get this typewriter into fully functioning working condition. I started by doing a really good air compressing of the machine. It was dusty, it was dirty, as are most things that are left in a basement for 50 years. So I went through and used my dad's air compressor to get rid of all of the gunk inside of this machine. I then went through the process of removing all the casing off of this machine once I got it home. The next thing I did was I went in with a wire brush and just removed all of that surface rust. Before rust goes too deep into the metal, you can remove a lot of it with just sanding and wire brushing. And for me, that was a really great way to get rid of all of the issues I was having, especially on the type bars of this machine and in the escapement. The other thing I had to do on this machine was really go through the type basket and clean it out. When you have type slugs that continuously get stuck, even after you've flushed the segment with mineral spirits and compressed air, it can indicate that there's something gunking up the tracks in there. So I went ahead and removed all of the type slugs from the basket and went through the process of wire brushing them all down and cleaning all of the surfaces. It removes any dust or dirt, or in this case surface rust, that could be causing it to get stuck in that track. And once I removed all of that and put them back into the type basket, I solved all of the type bar issues in the machine, and I had to do a little bit of forming and adjusting just to make sure everything aligned properly, but that solved a lot of those issues. The other thing that I still haven't fixed yet on this machine is there is a weak spring on the bottom that is causing the shift basket to get stuck and not engage all the time. But you can replace weak springs that are too stretched or not strong enough, by taking them out of parts machines. I have a whole bag that I'm going to go through and then eventually replace that spring so we can get it to fully functioning order. Now I was really impressed in working on this machine with just the construction detail in it. I've never worked on a Swiss machine before. I have really enjoyed working on my German build machines, things like the Olympias and the Adlers. I've just always liked how they are constructed. They're not as easily accessible. Excuse me. They're not as easily accessible as something like a Smith Corona for me to work on, and that might be just based on experience, but I did really enjoy how this machine came apart as a unit. The back flap folds down, which allows for you to access things like your margin and the back of a lot of the internal workings. The carriage comes off as a unit with just 2 bolts, so that is very easy and incredibly intuitive to remove. I have really become a big fan of removable carriages. Obviously, I love removable platens, but being able to remove the entire carriage unit allows you to get down to that escapement and flush it out and clean it. If you have trouble with your typewriter not advancing, often that is some sort of cleaning issue in your escapement. So being able to remove the entire carriage as a unit allowed for me to get in there and really flush it, clean it, and also wire brush it because I did have some rust damage in that area as well. The topper just sits in here, so that comes off really easily as well. And then the outer casing itself does have a few screws that hold it in. The feet also hold it in place on the bottom, so you do have to remove the feet and a few screws to get this outer casing off. But again, it comes off as a full unit. The inside construction of this machine is really interesting. The steel frame that it has is very geometric looking and just a really cool thing to look at in general as a piece of construction. I thought it was really fun to kind of investigate on this machine, take it apart and see how things worked, because it is built so differently than what I'm used to on the more American brand of typewriters. As far as features go on the Hermes machine, or at least my Hermes Ambassador, there are a few things that kind of stand out that are different than some of the other machines I've had. The ribbon feeding system, for example, is a very different sort of pathway. I had to watch someone else's video to learn how that worked, but it does feed through the ribbon vibrator in a very interesting way. So I had to follow a guide for that one because it was not intuitive for me at all. And if I had to replace it again, I probably would still have to follow a guide. I don't remember how it operates. It does have a touch selector as well, which allows for you to adjust the height or tension of your keys. And that is underneath the front lid. There is a slide there. So that's another really cool feature included on this typewriter. There are some models of the Hermes Ambassador that are electric, so they do have a motor in them. There are also some models of the Hermes Ambassador that have a carbon system in them as well. So a carbon ribbon or carbon cartridge system in them. You'll see that on ones that have like big reels underneath the front hood. I've included a link to a video by Hot Rod Typewriter where he showcases a Hermes Ambassador with these carbon reels in them. Mine doesn't have that system, but I thought that was also a really cool feature to include on a desk standard model that you might have from a brand. The Hermes Ambassador does feature what are called lightning margins. These are very similar to magic margins, which again are not my favorite, but it does have a non-visible margin system. So as you move your carriage to a certain place, you will hit one of the arrow buttons on the side to set your margin at that location. You can clear these by holding down the button and moving your carriage around. I don't like non-visible margins, but I do think these are at least a little bit more intuitive because they do have those arrow systems on them to show you where they might set. So not my favorite feature to have here on the Hermes. One other thing that I thought was a really notable cool feature on the Hermes Ambassador is that this front panel is a little bit inset. So you can actually set a notebook or a piece of paper here on this. It is displayed in the user manual for the model as well as a feature. So this allows for you to have some sort of note if you are transcribing. You have a section to actually lay whatever you're transcribing. And it gives a lot of purpose to how high the front of this machine is. It can be very difficult to actually see over this front casing on the machine while typing, but if you don't need that and you need somewhere to lay something you're transcribing instead, I do think that provides some sort of purpose to how large that front casing can be. So I thought that was a cool feature to include as well. As I was doing my type test of this machine, I did notice a few things from a user perspective that I wasn't sure if I was such a big fan of, and I know that these are specific again to the Ambassador models over the 3000s, but this was my first time really typing on a Hermes, and I did have an interesting experience. Here's a quick little sample of my type test. One of the things I noticed first on this machine is that I really enjoyed the feel of the keys. These are a plastic key. They're in this beautiful green color. They're very smooth. They are a little inset in the middle, so it allows for you to kind of sink into the key a little bit, but they've got lovely rounded edges. One of my big complaints with some of the Remington models and even some of the Olympias is that the edges of the keys can get really sharp if your fingers get stuck in them. I have long nails, so that happens to me quite frequently, but I loved the rounded design of the keys on this model specifically. However, in using this, if I had to do any formatting where I had to clear margins, I had to tab, I had to backspace, I really struggled with how large the keyboard was and how off to the side some of those commands are. So for example, a couple times I'd hit the end of the line and I'd have to hit the margin release button. It is on the right-hand side of the keyboard here at the bottom as an extra button, but there's a whole space of metal here in the keyboard that actually separates that key from the rest of the keys on the keyboard. I think the main feature of this is it keeps anything from kind of getting down into the keyboard and causing trouble, but it's so far away that it's not a pinky move for me, even though I'm a hunt and peck typer. It's a whole hand move for me, and it's not always the first thing I think of when I'm using the machine to move my entire hand to go and engage the margin release. Same with the backspace. I love how big the backspace button is and how large the tab button is, but I don't always think to go and click it because it's so far removed from the rest of the keyboard. So I did find that to be a little bit of an issue for me as I was working on typing with this machine. It's something I'd have to get used to. Anytime you get a new keyboard for your computer, you get used to the different widths and different sizes. The same happens here on the keyboard. I love the smooth feeling of how everything types on this machine. I really enjoyed that, but I think some of the keys are just a little too far for my comfort. However, I'm willing to put all of that aside, because this Hermes Ambassador also has a special typeface. So this machine does feature a Techno Typeface. I was super excited. I didn't realize it in the original ad for the machine when I purchased it. I didn't know until I got it in the car. And I opened the lid, which is one of the first things I do when I am inspecting a typewriter in the wild, and it had this very boxy and square looking O and 0. And I knew kind of instantly that that meant it had a Techno Typeface. The Techno Typeface kind of looks like what you would see on a computer screen in the 1970s in a spaceship. It's very boxy. It is based on a more square shape, but I love how this looks when written on a page. It feels so different despite only being slightly off from the original typeface. I have a script typewriter, and it's not my favorite to use because often I find it's really illegible to try and read some sort of script typefaces. I traditionally just go with whatever typeface is on the machine. I don't seek specific typefaces to fill out my collection. I have really enjoyed the Underwood Continental or Thyme typeface on the Underwood machines because it's just slightly more circular than oval, and slight delineations from the standard typeface really seem to be things that I enjoy having in my collection. And this is no exception, as it is just slightly off from the standard typeface. So finding the Techno Typeface on this typewriter was a nice little surprise as I got it into my car, and I do really like that that is a feature here on my Hermes Ambassador. It makes it even just a little bit more special. And look at this paper rest. That's insane looking. Who thinks to design something like that? I would say overall my experiences with this Hermes Ambassador have been really interesting. The construction of it, the way in which it's designed is different than what I'm used to working on. And for me, that makes it a really interesting process. I also think that the overall aesthetics of this machine make it stand out from many of the other typewriters in my collection. I have always loved the color on the Hermes machine. And it has been kind of a point of contention for how best to fix color issues on a machine when you have something like the paint damage I have here on this typewriter. And that led me into a bit of an investigation. And when I say bit of an investigation, I mean I bought a lot of paint. Typically with a machine that has this sort of rust damage underneath the paint, I would sandblast away all of the paint surfaces and the rust and repaint the whole thing. However, there's a very specific color to the Hermes machines that's very difficult to match, and I didn't want to lose the logoing across the back that was the maker's mark and where it was built, because to me that creates a lot of personal association with the machine itself and gives it a lot of personality. So I wanted to find another way to fix kind of the paint damage on this machine. I've seen lots of people use stickers as a way to kind of cover up any paint damage or body damage you might have on a typewriter, and I thought that might be a good solution for this machine. So I picked two themes, celestial and flowers, and posted a poll on my Instagram for 24 hours. And in the end, neither won. Nobody wanted to watch me put stickers on this machine to cover up the paint damage, and they requested that I don't do that. So I had to get a little bit more creative with how I was going to fix some of the damage on this machine. But one of the ways that I often fix paint damage on typewriters is by using the same color or paint color in nail polish. Nail polish is something I also collect, but it's also a really great way to get a small amount of paint with an associated brush that you can easily dab onto the surface of a typewriter. It is going to be a little bit more protective because it does have that drying quality to it, where it does dry and harden. So I've used nail polish on machines before to repair paint damage. The problem is that you have to get just the right color when it comes to color matching typewriters. I have been successful on other machines using a variety of tactics, mixing colors, getting custom shades. I'll link below my color matching videos, but this one posed quite a bit of a problem. When I first started realizing this trick of matching nail polish to typewriters, the first one that came up as a suggestion was Sally Hansen's Time is Money as a replacement for the Hermes paint. And I bought bottles of this immediately, even without owning a Hermes, because I wanted to have bottled Hermes paint color in my nail polish collection. Now I got the chance to actually try that color against the typewriter, and I gotta say, it's not the perfect match. So I then had to go and ask for other paint color suggestions and wound up buying a lot more nail polish. So in this pursuit of finding the right shade of green, I did want to start with kind of the usual suspects. I did start with Time is Money. I found a patch on the back of this machine and just did a quick little swatch. If you are trying to fix the paint on your typewriter, I recommend doing this in a more inconspicuous location, but I wanted this to be very visible for testing purposes. So I started with Time is Money, and I found it was a little too green. For me, it was just not the right tone or undertone. It's probably a little bit more yellow in its undertone, while the machine itself is a little bit more blue. The next one I tried was from Essie, and this is in the shade In the Modem. This was also recommended to me on Facebook. So this was another one that someone suggested as a good match for the Hermes paint color. I did try this one as well. It's too bright, and it's a very thin formula. On my nails, it actually takes 3 coats, which means it's not very opaque. So if you're trying to cover up dark rust damage, this doesn't seem to do it. So for me, this was a little too light of a shade. Around that same time, I also got a recommendation on Instagram. Someone mentioned Sinful colors in the eucalyptus scented shade called Eucalptiahhhh. I tried this as well. This is very close as well, but it is just a little bit brighter and more blue than the actual shade of the typewriter itself. Now the next thing I did was try to paint match in a couple different ways. I've had people suggest car paint to me before, as well as taking a piece of the typewriter and getting it color matched at Home Depot. So I tried both of those. I started with trying to find some sort of car paint that would be a good match for this. I did find a few sites that do custom car paint or car paint replacement pens to fix patches on your car if you have some sort of dent or paint damage. The problem with using sites like this is you can't color match to a photo. You actually have to select the model of the car and the manufacturer of paint color for the car. So this didn't work for me either, although I did get paint to match my new car because someone, myself, put a typewriter in it and actually damaged the paint on the car. So I did get a paint pen to fix that, but I wasn't able to match it to the machine itself. The other thing that was recommended was to go to Home Depot and get a color match based on the actual parts of the machine. The first time I did this, I took this top cover here with me to the paint store, and they have a little scanner that can scan some sort of thing, usually a paint chip, and color match based on the scan it takes. I took in this top cover, walked all the way through Home Depot with it, and they told me it was too large to scan. They wouldn't even try it or put it under their scanner. Now, if your equipment isn't going to be able to take a piece like that and color match, I totally understand. So I did have to get more creative with how I was going to color match based on the paint colors. What I did was I ended up swatching Time is Money on an index card and taking that into the store and having them mix custom paint based on that shade, since supposedly that's the match for the Hermes paint color. I tried this on the machine as well, and again, this is just a little too green. I did get the semi-matte formula, which is more of what you would get on the typewriter finish itself to get that right kind of shade and shine on the actual paint. So the last thing I tried was making my own custom shade to match the typewriter based on photos. And this is where you guys came in handy again. So I was looking at some of the comments on one of my previous videos, and I got this comment from someone who suggested I white balance my camera before taking my photo so that the color would be more accurate. This is a thing I know I should do. I never white balance my camera. I know I have to and that I should, and I don't know why I didn't think of it before, but I'm gonna try that this time to see if we can get a more accurate color for paint matching our Hermes typewriter. And I'm joined by a new kitty cat who is somewhere in here meowing. So I got my own specific shade made by Blank Beauty to match the typewriter based on the color balanced and white balanced photo that I took. And while this is close, it is a little bit too bright. It's very similar to the Essie color here. So this is a much brighter shade. It actually might work on some parts of the machine depending on the lighting, but because it has a white base to get such a light pastel color, it's going to look too bright compared to the original paint that was there. I do think if you wanted to really do a great restoration job, repainting anytime that you have surface rust or damage underneath the paint is the way to go. You would sandblast whatever piece you're doing, you would then prime it and then paint over it. I have done that before, and I find that to be the best way to get a really smooth finish on a typewriter. Obviously, you seal that in with top coat as well. In a case where you don't have a ton of patches to fix and you can find a color match, specifically on black machines. I found that to be the best because the glossy black finish of a typewriter is very similar to the glossy black finish of a nail polish. So I've used that trick on those as well. That works really well for me. In the case of the Hermes, I don't have an answer for you. And the shades of green on a Hermes 3000 are very different than the gray-green color here on the Ambassador. And so that might be different for whatever you might have to paint match on your machine. And if I could put stickers on it, I could cover that up, but that would make everybody angry. So now I have a Hermes typewriter in my collection, and I'm very excited by being able to add this as a model that I now have experience with. Every time I'm confronted with a new brand, I'm learning new things about how they operate, how they're constructed, and how to work on these machines. I've spent the most amount of time with American brands like Royal and Smith Corona, and so I feel like I really know how they're constructed. But when I'm confronted with something new and European in design, I learn a whole new way of how these machines were manufactured, how they were constructed, and how they expected the user to interact with these machines. They're very intuitive to take apart. I really like the construction details on this machine, and it seems like, at least in the desk standard model, they were going for function over fashion, and some of the features make it heavier but also make it more heavy duty, and it's going to last a lot longer than some of the other desk standards I've worked on from other brands. So for me, this is a win. I get a cool typeface, I get to work with a new brand, and I get to stretch my paint matching skills a little bit, and I'm really excited with how the process was of repairing this machine. It's not pretty to look at in a lot of cases because of the damage. It's not perfect either. I still have to replace a spring on the bottom. But for me, the experience and the joy of getting a new typewriter is getting to work on it and learn how it works. So for me, that's the best part of getting to try out this Hermes brand in my collection. If you're interested in other typewriter content, I do some other videos here on this YouTube channel as well as on my Instagram at just.my.typewriter. And I thank you all so much for watching and remind you, you're just my type. Writer. One thing I didn't mention is this really interesting paper injection system. It's got this very beefy looking lever here on the right side of the carriage that feeds paper in through your roller. It's just very heavy duty. I haven't used it successfully yet, but very interesting feature to have, and I think that again would add to that nature of it being a really effective office machine. A lot of the times I think the desk standards probably have too many features for me as a very casual user. A lot of them are based on what you would need in a real office environment. And I do think that's a great feature to have on here for someone who might need a paper injector like this that's going to take several sheets at a time and roll it for you so that you don't have to roll the levers. But for me, I don't really need it. I think it's cool, but I don't know how to use it personally. One other thing I found really interesting on this typewriter was the inclusion of a tag here. So this would be some sort of inventory tag. So if you know anything about the Butterick company, let me know in the comments below so I can figure out where this typewriter was from.